Hi, my name is Tyler Church, and I chose to analyze Body Politics, Power, Sex, and Nonverbal Communication by Nancy Hanley. This was a very interesting book. I wasn't too sure what I was getting myself into when I picked this. All I knew is I knew the power dynamic between two people in a relationship is something that interests me greatly. In fact, it's a big reason why I'm pursuing a degree in communication. What I'll be doing for the rest of the presentation is I'll be breaking down the chapters one by one and just giving everyone a little bite-sized piece of information. So chapter one of body politics is titled The Other Dimension, and this sort of introduces us to the concept of power and status and nonverbal communication. In interpersonal relationships, status and power are important topics that often go unchecked in most relationships. However, it is something that affects everyone. Unlike a friendship where both participants are on equal horizontal playing fields, many relationships involve having one person in dominance of the relationship while the other is labeled as a subordinate. The chapter goes on to talk about how verbal communication is taught in schools. However, nonverbal communication is something picked up for survival. Many children are taught not to stare and point. They might be taught not to play with yourself in public. Mind your flatulence. But apart from these, our knowledge of nonverbal communication growing up is extremely limited. Many experiments were done and covered in this chapter, ranging from proof that people are able to quickly pick up on emotions instinctively to the fact that white people are more likely to stigmatize blacks during interviews. And it was also found that women are more sensitive to nonverbal cues than men are. Chapter 2, titled Don't Fence Me In, starts with a brief definition of territoriality and comparing how humans and animals alike both use it. Even in animals, there is a hierarchy, a power dynamic, and vertical dominance levels between them. Some chickens live in higher areas where it's less cramped. Some chickens sit on the ground where it is crowded, and the chickens above can peck at them. This is an example of spatial dominance, where there are multiple ways that space reflects dominance in animals. Animals in power control more territory. They are freer to move in other animal territories. They are given more personal space. Subordinates move out of their way for the dominant animals, and dominants occupy territories controlling desired resources. A big example of this in modern day society is you can look at a courtroom. The judge is normally placed on a seat higher than other people because he's a person of authority and he's a person that should be dominating the situation. Space was a rather large chapter, so we're going to talk about it a little more. And this sort of talks about more what we were talking about in our proximity chapter, the different zones. So there's the intimate zone that goes from 0 to 6 inches, and it encompasses sex, wrestling, and other forms of physical contact. You can go through personal distance, social distance, and public distance. And certain distances are appropriate for different types of reactions with different people. And without reading verbatim off of the slide, a big portion of this chapter talked about how you can sort of gain power in a engagement based off of how you position yourself. Because generally speaking, it talks about if it's going to be a longer engagement, you want to have some distance in between each other to keep everyone comfortable. However, if you can sort of bring yourself closer to the person, it puts you on top of the conversation. Chapter 3, Don't Clock Me In, touches on duration and engagements between people. An engagement with a stranger asking for directions is going to be brief, while a conversation with someone you are intimate with will likely last much longer. It becomes apparent that time zones are directly proportional to your intimacy with someone, while space zones are inversely proportional. People tend to spend certain amounts of time at certain zones as well, ranging from mere seconds at public distance, a few minutes at social distance, upwards of 30 minutes at personal, and upwards of hours at intimate distance. This gets back onto proximity, what we were talking about in last chapter. The more dominant person in a relationship is normally the one who dictates the length of an interaction and its nature. This brings up an issue of time hogging, however, as there is practically infinite space, but not infinite time. People in power control their time, while less dominant people, such as subordinates, have the time controlled for them, i.e. clocking in and out while the boss comes and goes as he pleases. An example of this is that curfews are more often placed on women than men. This is going to be the first chapter where we start to dive into the second part of the title, sex. This book definitely does a lot of comparing between men and women, and it's very surprising to see the different amount of power dynamics that women have to go through and how their nonverbal communication is really dictated by society far more than men's is. Chapter 4, called Painting the Powerscape, brings up how order and height affect our social hierarchy. The chapter touches more on proximity and power, explaining that a woman might take different precautions or even completely avoid certain areas of the city. This puts them lower in the hierarchy and lessens their scale of power. Power dynamic in sex is it's in the title, it's a big portion of the book. Chapter 5, Tinkling Symbols, begins by explaining how addressing a person, communicating a level of power in a relationship. Addressing someone by their first name versus a Mr./Mrs. title communicates different levels of power in a relationship. You may call your buddy Joe because you guys are on a neutral playing field. However, you might call your coworker, Mr. or Mrs. Smith instead of their first name. It's supposed to be more formal. The chapter also talks about differences in communication between men and women. Something I found interesting was that while women do anatomically have a higher pitched voice compared to men, we also subconsciously change our tone to fit our social roles. Women generally speak softly as society has normalized this, generalizing that if a woman is not following the status quo, she's being loud. This is often why women are more passive, because if not, they're seen as rude and bitchy. Chapter 6 talks about demeanor, and it begins by elaborating on the tie between bodily behaviors and power, and goes on to talk about demeanor. As a listed example, it is difficult to find a picture of a powerful politician with tobacco or alcohol. This is because it paints a picture in the viewer's mind of the person. Like this, bodily functions such as passing gas and coughing are grotesque. It explained that a person's engagement towards a situation also displays a level of power. By avoiding separate engagements such as reading or, in this case, coughing, you are dedicating yourself to the engagement, increasing your power. Difference in demeanor is also a large part of first impressions. Chapter 7, which talks on touch, talks about the relation touch has to power. Historically speaking, touch has always been a topic of importance, ranging from the painting of the Sistine Chapel, which I learned that was changed. Originally, the painting of the Sistine Chapel it includes God coming down to touch human, but in the Bible, it says it is God's nasal breath. Deeper than our connection to mysticism is our connection to wanting physical contact. Touch is a necessary need for humans, as social deprivation can be catastrophic. People in different relationships also use touching in different ways. You may hug your sibling, kiss your significant other, while you may not lay a finger on someone of a higher power, such as an employer. Chapter 8, which goes over posture, gesture, body movement, focuses on presentation of yourself and others' affects your power dynamic. Many factors of your life affect your posture, gestures, and body movement, such as your race, education, employment, sex, age. Tying in the book's theme of comparing sex, women generally sit with legs near or fully crossed, while men open their legs an average between 10 and 15 degrees. On top of this, there are many social functions that a woman adopts throughout life that men do not use. These are included but not limited to sitting cross-legged, walking with rigid, exaggerated posture, and taking shorter strides with their steps. Chapter 9, which talks more about eye contact, talks about the relationship eye contact has with power. The first section of the chapter, titled It's Not Polite to Stare, talks about the negative effect eye contact can have. People who stare are often regarded as being in control of the nonverbal signal, which makes other people uncomfortable. It has been researched that women make more eye contact than men do, especially with each other. I believe this is the last chapter that we will be going over, which is titled Smile When You Say That, which talks about facial expressions. Many nonverbal facial gestures are commonly used to exhibit certain emotions, including but not limited to eye rolling, smiling, moving the eyebrows, and winking. Keeping with the theme of comparing sex, women more often than not smile in social situations because it's what a society is deemed appropriate. Women are told frowning is ugly, and men are often told that it's ugly to cry. Getting onto the impact and critique, Body Politics was written in 1977 and chock full of information regarding the many facets of nonverbal communication. Everything we have discussed in class up to this moment was brought up in the book in far more incredible detail and much more information than I would not even think when thinking about nonverbal communication. The book was incredibly interesting. Everyday things such as where we stand in relation to strangers, how we sit in public, and anatomical functions are considered when writing this book. And due to this, I'm a much more educated person. Throughout the book, men and women are repeatedly compared between the many social differences between the two sexes. Much research was done, and each claim was backed up by numerous sources. In conclusion, Body Politics, Power, Sex, and Nonverbal Communication by Nancy Henley is an extremely interesting and thought-provoking book that dives into the intricate nonverbal communication that we use in our daily lives. From the power dynamic that occurs between all people and relationships to the many differences that men and women face in our society, there's something new to learn for everyone that decides to pick up this book.